Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is teaming up with Debra Evans Smith, former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterintelligence Division at FBI headquarters here in DC. And Debra has a very rich and varied career, so I'm just hitting on a few points. Her early FBI career included working Russian foreign counterintelligence and organized crime for the Los Angeles field office. In 1996, she transferred to the Washington field office, continuing her work in Russian foreign counterintelligence investigations, and she was promoted to supervisor in the Overseas Espionage Unit position at FBI headquarters. And she managed multiple espionage cases there. And in 2000, she was assigned to supervise an espionage squad at the Washington field office. And that very notably included the investigation of former FBI special agent Robert Hansen. In 2002, she received the Attorney General's Award for Excellence for her work on that investigation and the National Intelligence Certificate of Distinction. A little bit more on her career, very lengthy and interesting. In August 2006, Smith was promoted to Assistant Special Agent in charge of the San Diego Division and oversaw responsibility for the intelligence, border liaison, security, media, and community outreach programs. In 2008, she was selected to serve as chief of the Counter-Espionage Group, CIA. Later, she was selected to serve as special assistant to FBI Director Mueller. In 2010, she was named special agent in charge of the administrative division at the Washington field office and subsequently transitioned to special agent in charge of Washington's Counterintelligence Division. After retirement, Smith returned to the FBI and completed her career as a diversity and inclusion senior level program manager from 2016 to 2019. She has a very interesting background. I know there's things happening in the world today that she has a unique perspective on. All right, Chris, I haven't done her justice, but you may make more sense of her illustrious career than I have done in my reading aloud. Over to you, Chris.
Hey, thanks for the great introduction and welcome to people tuning in today. How lucky and how timely it is to have Debra here today because of her experience working against Russian organized crime and her deep counterintelligence experience. Of course, the big story right now and what makes this so special today is Ukraine. The situation on the ground there is playing out literally live as we speak. But the bottom line is we've been talking here at Spy Chat about Ukraine since late fall and before the new year. And I have suggested for some time, it's my perspective based on what I'm seeing in open source intelligence, that it is inevitable that Putin is going to invade and direct Russian forces to invade Ukraine at some level. What's fascinating about the story that's playing out live is the fact that the intelligence has been made very public. The United States in particular and other Western intelligence agencies has made public the fact that it seems that an invasion is imminent. Now, what that we don't know. We normally are unable, we being people from the intelligence community, we're not great at predictions necessarily. It's about judgments. And I think the community judges right now that an attack is imminent that will be ordered by Putin. Russian forces will cross the border. They have arrayed forces somewhere between 150 and 170,000. It depends what your outlets are for news. It is a very interesting dynamic. And as I reflect on that dynamic, we have a gallery at the Spy Museum making sense of secrets. And I'll take you back to 1962, and we explore the mysteries of decision makers during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And during that crisis, we wondered, what was Khrushchev going to do? What was Kennedy going to do? Based on their upbringing, their experiences, and what we know about those leaders. And I think some of those predictions really bore themselves out through the lens of history. The analysts were right. Putin, on the other hand, we don't know exactly what's in his head right now. So from a national security standpoint, this is clearly the big story. So moving on from an intelligence standpoint, let me more narrowly focus on second part of the story, and that is this idea that very specific intelligence has been released to the public that we are to expect a false flag operation. What does that mean? It means that there's a justification for war that Putin is looking for, meaning there's already been various variegated forms of disinformation that have been released, such as there's genocide playing out in Donbass, which is the Russian-speaking disputed region on the ground in Ukraine. There's been a tit for tat, there's been some fighting, there's been some back and forth. That very likely will be a pretext for Russia to say, this is not a war of choice. We have to respond defensively to protect Russian interests in the Ukraine. So this story will continue to play out. I find it fascinating and I find it interesting on how intelligence is being used. And we can talk more about our respective opinions. I would love to hear more from Debra on this, and certainly there'll be questions that will dive deeper on Ukraine. So I'm going to transition very briefly to another story that I'm tracking that got my attention in the past weeks. The Justice Department, the US Department of Justice, stood up a new unit. I suspect it's some kind of task force to look at domestic violent extremism, domestic terrorism, to help combat and counter the threat of domestic terrorism here in the United States. So that means the DOJ is going to husband their resources. There'll be a group of dedicated attorneys that will synchronize and coordinate their efforts more effectively and efficiently. I think that is the objective of the new task force. I do know that the new national security head of DOJ is Matt Olson. I know Matt, I trust his judgment. He was formerly in the previous administration, not Trump, but before that, he was in charge of the National Counterterrorism Center. So I think he is well positioned also to provide lots of oversight and insights on DVE, domestic violent extremism. Last big story I want to talk about is the idea of a resurgent ISIS. When I left the White House in 2018, I was very concerned that the physical caliphate of ISIS would go away. And over time, ISIS was not dead. It wasn't defeated. It would essentially go underground. And that's what we continue to see playing out. However, there was some good news from a US perspective. The United States can focus on two things clearly at once: global power competition, meaning countering malign Russian behavior that we're going to talk about today. But at the same time, the United States conducted a raid in Idlib, which is in northwest Syria. It is essentially a tough part of this Syrian countryside. There's a lot of al-Qaeda operators. We know that al-Baghdadi hid out there. It is certainly not friendly for US forces. US forces executed a raid to kill al-Qureshi. So I think that was very good news. And the 2 points I want to make to our audience: first, open source reporting has suggested that there were human intelligence assets, informants or watchers on the ground, and that's very important. They were able to provide some surveillance of the house that Qureshi was in. At the same time, it was also revealed in the media that certainly the United States was using drones. So the combination, human sources on the ground and drones above, were able to cue the raiders, and there was essentially an excellent special operations force mission to conduct a raid on Qureshi. Of course, he blew himself up, much like al-Baghdadi. Tragically, he killed members of his family, to include children. The last story, I just want to remind folks that there are still Western hostages on the ground in Afghanistan. Last Friday, some good news: 2 Western hostages were released. That means there are still, by my count, there are still 7 hostages being held by the Taliban, and they come from mostly the UK, 6 individuals, and of course, Mark Frericks from the United States is still being held by the Taliban or some network that is associated to the Taliban. More than likely, it is the Haqqani network. From a book recommendation standpoint, there is a lot of talk recently about this notion of the possibility of civil war. There were some programs on that just last night. In fact, for the last month, I've done some research and followed up on some books and some periodicals, and certainly some great journalistic reporting on the possibility. So it is truly, this whole argument of a potential civil war has gone mainstream. So just to dispel some myths about this argument, we're not talking about civil war in terms of the blue and the gray from the 1860s during the American Civil War. I think the author in the book, How Civil War Starts, is really talking about essentially an uptick in political violence here in the United States. So I'm not going to tell you one way or the other where I fall out on this book, but I think it's an important mainstream discussion that is happening here in the United States and abroad. And I think it's worth your time to track down Barbara F. Walters' book and decide for yourself. Is the United States vulnerable at this point because of polarization, because of the times we live in? So I think it's worth reading. So lastly, 2 questions really, so we can listen to Debra, and I'm really excited about hearing her perspectives. First, Debra, can you share your perspectives on domestic terrorism, the possibility for more domestic violent extremism here in the United States? And secondly, maybe you can segue to talk about your perspectives, having studied and worked against Russian intelligence officers. So I kick it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you so much for having me here today on Spy Chat. It's really an honor. So I'll get right to it. We'll start with domestic violent extremists. I'll call it DVE, much easier. It's not a new thing in this country. We've dealt with it for a very long time, but we didn't have it designated, and we didn't have a name for it like we do today. So, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about what's the oldest DVE organized extremist group that we have had in this country, and I thought of the KKK. And so if somebody wants to think of it that way, I think that may be a jumping point, or it's just that what I thought about initially. But I looked at data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The data went from 1995 to 2021. And what it indicates is a recent surge in DT incidents, not seen in a quarter century. And the data also says that it's driven, for the most part, by white supremacists, anti-government, and anti-Muslim extremists on the far right. There were peaks during that time frame. 1995 was a peak. 2015 and 2020 were all peaks, 2020 being the highest. And there were also some lower, a couple years where the numbers were lower, and that was 2006 and 2007. So in looking at that, what I thought is that we should really not ignore what was going on in the country at that time, what was going on with the government, what was going on socially, and what was going on internationally, especially when those spikes occurred, but also when we had the low points, because it would be good to see what was going on and what maybe sparked some of these things. So I just looked at 1 year. In the interest of time, I looked at 1995. And the government in 1995 stopped funding the internet, and it became privatized. And it resulted in easy internet access to the public. That's a game changer, number one, right there. Also, there were other things that happened that year. There was the O.J. Simpson trial. Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment, becoming the last state to approve the abolition of slavery. The Oklahoma City bombing happened that year. The Unabomber was active. There were 2 Americans who were held as spies by Iraq. They were released by Saddam Hussein. 10 people were convicted of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and the Million Man March was held in Washington, D.C., which was conceived by Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam. So I'm sure there were more things that happened that year, but that year was a spike. And some of those items that I mentioned are things that people become emotional about. And that type of information really should be analyzed. Correlations should be made, and we should learn from those correlations. And possibly in the future, we can be proactive and work to reduce violent extremism and domestic terrorism in the future. I always think that if we really don't know and examine what happened in the past, and possibly why it happened, we really won't be able to reduce those things from happening in the future. So hopefully someone is doing that. I don't know. Hopefully it's happening. So domestic terrorism doesn't have the same authorities as counterterrorism or as counterintelligence does. It's not a statute, or we don't have a DT law, which means that the investigators who are doing that work, they really have to use existing criminal violations, which that's something that I think should be looked at and should be changed. There are 4 main domestic terrorism categories that we saw more activity, or we see most activity in today. Excuse me. Overall, there are about 7 categories, but these 4 are the most active. The first, as I spoke about, is racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. Then anti-government and anti-authority extremists, and then animal rights and environmental and abortion extremists to round out the top 4 that are occurring in the United States today. And a lot of times people think that the FBI can just open up a DT investigation because something happens. Well, that's not actually the case. There are specific requirements that have to be met. And there are 3 of them. The first is that a violation of federal law has to have happened. Second, the activity has to be wholly or in part involve force or violence. And then the activity has to be intended to further political or social goals. And that differs from a hate crime. A lot of times people don't really know what the difference is between a hate crime and a violent extremist or domestic terrorism case. Well, a hate crime, again, it's a criminal offense against a person, or it can be against property, and it's motivated in whole or in part by the individual's bias against a race, a religion, a disability, someone's sexual orientation, their ethnicity, their national origin, those types of things. And a good example of that is a case that's ongoing right now, and that's the trial of the 3 individuals convicted of the murder of Ahmad Aubry in Georgia, I believe. So the prosecutors in this case are seeking to prove that those defendants' actions were motivated by their bias. And that's not always an easy thing to do, because bias, hate speech, those are not crimes in this country. So it's not an easy correlation for a prosecutor to always make in those types of cases. And one quote from Director Wray before I move on to Russia. And this he stated back in, I think, March of last year when he was testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He said the amount of angry, hateful, unspeakable, combative, violent rhetoric on social media exceeds what anyone in their worst imagination thinks is out there. And I just, that quote, it gets to me because it's very compelling and it's frightening. I'm sure he sees a lot more than most. And for him to make that statement is just, it's just very compelling. Okay, I'm going to move on to Russia in the interest of time. So much has been happening between Russia and Ukraine. The news is moving so quickly. And I think if someone asked me maybe a couple weeks ago what I thought would happen or whether or not Russia would actually invade Ukraine, um, I thought that they would do it because they were building the forces there, and but I didn't really very strongly feel that way. But when I woke up this morning, still didn't have a very strong opinion about it. But I think three things in the news this morning sort of moved me to that much stronger feeling that an invasion is imminent. The first is the president basically said today that there's a chance of Russia invading Ukraine is very high. And for him to say that, there has to be some intelligence behind it. And for him to use those words, very high, that is probably a game changer. It's a game changer in my mind. Also, Russia expelled a diplomat. I think Chris talked about that. The number two, the deputy chief of missions, was expelled. I was trying to think in my mind, why? Were we getting some intelligence in Russia and putting it out that they didn't want us to have? Sometimes there's retaliation for things like that. Are they doing it in an attempt to divert attention? We just don't know yet. And then there was a statement from NATO saying that they're worried that Russia is staging a pretext for the attack. So if they're staging a pretext, then they're pretty much going to do it. I can't see a reason to stage a pretext now and then wait a couple of months. If you're staging a pretext, you're pretty much there. And then the troops are continuing to build in Russia. So that has, and they're saying that the troops are moving back, but satellite and intelligence is saying that no, the opposite is happening, that he's building troops and actually moving closer to the border. With that all said, I don't know exactly what Putin is going to do. I just think he's a wild card and he's going to make up his own mind. But I will say that Putin intends to remain in power. I think for as long as he can, for as long as he lives. So he has to give some thought to the Russian people and what they think, which means that he would like to provide some type of justification should Russia invade Ukraine. And this is why we are reading and hearing about these reports, the false flags or fake videos or genocide and those types of things that Chris also spoke to. And also, Putin wants total Russian influence over Ukraine. I think this is something that he's wanted for a long time. And it's a great thing that information that the US is getting is being made public. And hopefully it keeps Putin a little bit off balance. I don't think that he expected that to happen. But Putin appears to be willing to risk tremendous loss of life and hardship for the Russian people in order to take Ukraine. And no matter what happens with this current buildup, as long as Putin's in power, I don't think that he will give up on that endeavor, ever. Diplomacy, I'll just briefly touch on that. It does not appear to be working. NATO is not going to close its doors. The possibility of Ukraine taking NATO off the table has been in the news. But just this morning, Ukrainian's ambassador to the United States basically stated that that the membership in NATO is a goal of Ukraine and that it's in their constitution. So it doesn't look like that's going to happen either. So Putin likely felt that NATO, I think, would not hold together as it has, but he still has options. He can pressure Ukraine by cutting gas transit, he can use cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, disinformation tactics, wreak havoc basically in Ukraine and confusion, and possibly considerably weaken their government, perhaps with the hope of toppling the government without a full-on scale invasion. But in the end, I think an important question is Is this about Ukraine becoming a NATO member sometime in the future? Or is it really about Putin's desire to retake Ukraine? And that may, in part, dictate his actions. Okay, so those are the two questions that were posed to me by Chris. And I would like to briefly go over a few things, some stories that I'm following. The first is, it goes back to Director Wray. He earlier this month gave an interview on NBC where he discussed Chinese spying and specifically the ongoing economic espionage threat in China. He stated that there's no country that presents a broader, more severe threat to our innovation and ideas and our economic security than China. And that the Bureau opens a new counterintelligence case against China 2 times a day. That's a lot. We all know that China targets a wide range of our innovation, technology. And the way I look at it, if it's technology, it's something that they can steal and profit off of, especially to the detriment of the United States, they're going to do it. And they're pretty good. They're very good at it. Director Wray has spoken about this over the years, and he continues to bring this very important matter to the attention of the US public. But over 10 years ago, when I was special agent in charge at the Washington field office, economic espionage was very much on our radar, even back then. And we started doing outreach to the private sector and to universities to educate and make them aware of the threat, and also to encourage them to reach out to the FBI should they encounter a threat or should they even suspect that is happening. And so it's good to see that those messages are continuing. Another story that I'm following is the Stewart Rhodes case. Rhodes is the founder and leader of the right-wing extremist group, the Oath Keepers, who was charged with seditious conspiracy regarding the events on January 6th. Rhodes recently went before a judge in an effort to reverse his the order that he has to remain jailed pending his trial, which is in July, on charges that he guided a month-long effort to unleash political violence to prevent President Biden from being inaugurated. So he and his co-conspirators are the first from that day to be charged with seditious conspiracy. His background I find interesting. He's a former Army paratrooper and a Yale Law School graduate. He pled not guilty, and he actually voluntarily met with the FBI prior to his indictment, and he gave them access to his phone. I think the judge is going to decide the case tomorrow. And last, I'll talk really quickly about the Olympics. I know some people think, well, you're probably thinking, how does that fit into counterintelligence? But there's a question that's been bantered around for years. Should the Olympics be held in a permanent location? There are a lot of older articles about this, not too many new ones, but periodically the Olympics are held in countries that are experiencing some type of political discourse or human rights issues, such as the current Olympics and with China. And that has led to the United States decision not to send a delegation of dignitaries to China. And I like quotes. So this is a quote from a woman who is the foreign ministry spokeswoman in Russia. She says, as soon as there are talks about a country which is not part of the Western Circle hosting the Olympic Games, situations surrounding everything becomes tense immediately. Human rights, national interests, regional conflicts, and many more. So that sort of goes to what I'm saying here. Olympics should be about the athletes and not so much about politics and what's going on in any particular country at that time. And there are definitely pros and cons to this. Permanent locations would alleviate, I think, some of the political human rights issues, but a con is that most people love the opportunity to showcase their countries. So it moves from one country to another, and the opening ceremonies are usually just wonderful and spectacular, and you learn so much about the host country during that ceremony. But it also means that countries without the means to host an Olympic Games will never get the opportunity to showcase themselves. And so the world is missing out on that. So if held in permanent locations, this opportunity could be provided to any country or multiple countries during any one Olympics, where they can showcase themselves, set up shops and restaurants and areas to show their culture in the Olympic Village. I think sometimes that the Olympics, to me, I love the Olympics, first of all, but I hate to see them politicized. And so that's the reason why I brought that up. And actually, those are my, I think I'm out of time here. I think those are the things that I'm tracking right now.
You are never out of time, Deborah. This is your hour, and it was very interesting and wide-ranging. Do you have any comments, Chris, before I take you on the wild ride?
Just briefly, just to give Deborah a break and give you a chance to tee up the next question or the first question, I just want to underscore this idea of deception by Putin, deception by the Russians. I've heard the last couple of days a term of art that I haven't heard for a while, but I certainly studied it, not only in the 90s, but learned about it as a young intelligence officer in the 1980s when we were squared off with the Soviet Union. And the term doesn't have an exact translation. It's called maskirovka, and it talks to deception, multi-layered deception. And it's over 100 years as a concept of employing deception, cover, camouflage, denial, and disinformation. And what we're seeing play out is right from the Russian playbook. And the fact that we're using intelligence to counter that, I think, is an excellent strategy. And when I say we, I'm talking about Western intelligence services. Ukraine was a little more concerned with perhaps panicking the population, but the United States has been very clear. And all of this intelligence has been used not to make a case for war, as Secretary Blinken just said, it's to prevent a war. So that's something we can reflect on. So over to you, Amanda. I'm excited about the opportunity to hear some great questions.
Yeah, and of course, there are a lot about what we predicted, but they are really wide ranging. So I'm going to try to group them together, but we'll kick it off, I think, with questions related to Ukraine. And you both mentioned the US diplomat that was, subject to expulsion today. Are we likely to send Russian diplomats home as a result?
Yep.
I'll start with that one. I would say yes. Normally when that happens, it's usually we have the reaction as other countries have when we PNG an individual from our country. They usually retaliate and do the same thing. So I would expect that the United States would. There's a possibility that we won't, but I would expect that we would. Not knowing the specific reason, or if any reason was given at all, I'm curious about that, of course, but I would expect that we would do the same.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, thanks, Deborah. Yes, I think absolutely. This is the classic tit for tat. Of course, we don't know why the deputy was sent home or is going to be PNG, declared persona non grata. But also there was an interesting article. I have not had the time to do the analysis of it, but yesterday, interestingly, I believe a Mexican citizen in Florida in the United States was charged, I think, for being an unregistered Russian agent. So this, again, it's all interlocked. For the last several years, we've been talking about Russian operations, intelligence operations and PNGs throughout Europe. I think that those PNGs are going to proliferate with some of the European NATO states as well, because Russian intelligence activities are going to grow exponentially. Russian intelligence officers have been extremely aggressive. Now, if they go on a war footing and they're engaged in a conventional conflict, the Russians are very adept at complementing that with asymmetrical attacks, meaning Russian intelligence officers operating against US and Western interests worldwide. So, we're not going to be hysterical about it, but we know that these kinds of things are going to play out. So I expect we're going to see some more tit for tat.
One thing, it was so interesting, Deborah, when you were talking, you really put us into the shoes of a CI officer when you were talking about, well, the president made this comment, so that means it's serious. It's always so interesting to hear what you all know from your experience, we're all looking at the same open source stuff, but you can read in. So we really appreciated that perspective behind the scenes here. Few more questions related to this issue. Could Ukraine seek non-NATO ally status?
I'm curious as to what this person means by non-NATO ally status.
So I can jump. Go ahead, Deborah. I'm sorry.
Because I think they're already in that category, because we see all the NATO countries coming to their assistance. We're not going to be on the ground fighting with them, but financially, materials, intelligence, I'm sure. So they're already, I think, in that status.
Yeah, I was going to just add, Deborah, and I apologize for cutting you off. I just wanted to add that I'm not sure of their status either, but for all intents and purposes, they are an ally. They're just not under, I think it's Article 5 or Section 5 of the NATO alliance. They're obviously not a part of NATO. That's part of the dispute. NATO would be probably reluctant to bring them into the fold in the short term. Again, this is another ploy for Putin. It's another grievance that he has rolled out, that he continues to roll out, another pretext. But at the end of the day, for all intents and purposes, they do have some kind of allied status. They certainly are a partner. We had U.S. military forces on the ground in the Ukraine doing engagements. They were pulled out, just a short time ago because we're going to potentially general war in the Ukraine. We'll see what happens as that plays out. But I think for all intents and purposes, they already are a special partner for the United States and in other countries that are part of NATO. They just don't have the status where all of NATO supports Ukraine with military forces as a result of an invasion. But each country has the respective, sovereign authority to support the Ukraine. So that's how I would answer that question.
One guest has, and Deborah, you touched upon this a little bit. This was a guest saying in a book that he had read that the KGB back in the old days never trusted Putin. He made careless, not calculated, or took careless risks. What have you come across anything? What does the intelligence community think about Putin's mindset? And we have a very cool exhibit at the Spy Museum about psychological analysis of Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So have we seen any profiling that you want to expand upon, or just what you said, Deborah, that he's not going to give up power until he dies?
I haven't seen any profiling on Putin. I'm just going by basically what I've seen and experienced and his actions. So yes, I stick with that. I don't think that he's ever going to give that up. I think he'll work on it until it's done, or until he's no longer president, or he's no longer empowered in Russia.
So if I could jump in there and just offer this, that just a little advertising for next month. Dr. Fiona Hill, who's testified on the Hill was a Russian expert in the Trump administration. She just published a book. She also recently published, or actually it's a little dated, but it gets into the Putin mindset. And I happen to be reading it right now, and I'm trying to pull it off of my phone. But the bottom line, you can look up, Fiona Hill has written a book. She has a co-author. It's an excellent book. And it really tries to get into Putin's head. But he is a bit of an enigma. He is enigmatic. We don't know exactly. There are some gaps in his personal history. There are some questions on how he had such a meteoric rise in the Russian context. So he certainly had the approval of Yeltsin, and he seemed to be a made man at some point in his political career. But there are a lot of gaps in his history. Again, Fiona Hill will talk to us next month, and she might provide additional insights, and I look forward to hearing that from her.
One more question along those lines. Is there, are we working to get negative information out, to Russians about Putin? We always talk about Russian disinformation and what they're feeding us and how they're churning the West up. Do we have any chops in that division, or are we working hard?
Do you want to take that one, Chris?
Yeah, I would just say, I think the administration, by calling out the fact that we are seeing a Russian playbook, calling out Russia, the Western media outlets, for lying, setting up for a pretext of war. In effect, that word does trickle down into the Russian population. But at the end of the day, the Russian population also is completely, I shouldn't say completely, but much of them are committed to this notion that Russia is defending its interests. But again, just to underscore and to kind of think at a macro level, this idea that the United States in particular is flagging Russian disinformation, I think that is in effect important messaging for the Russian people. That's not normal diplomatic behavior. That is not what we expect from state leaders. So I think just by virtue of the fact that the West is committed to calling out Putin's lies almost in real time, that is an important change to how the United States uses intelligence historically and routinely. And more importantly, there has been a change in the last few years, and that is the United States is frankly responsible to protect its capabilities and its methods and its sources. But at the same time, the United States has been absolutely flagging disinformation and calling it out. So I think that is a very important change in our approach to diplomacy, candidly.
And I totally agree with that. The only thing that I would add is I'm curious as to how the Russian people are taking this information.
Right.
Because they are so used to disinformation or misinformation that they may not know what to believe. So that's just my curiosity as to how they're taking the information that they're receiving.
Well, and it's so interesting to see interviews with people, with Ukrainians, about what's going on. Is the war happening? And there was a fun story yesterday about kind of an aerial view, and someone's actually advertising for a garage for sale, and it was the Russian embassy in Ukraine. So, I mean, they're living in this moment. We're all nervous and tense, and those folks are living through it, and it's just kind of staggering, trying to sort out what's real, what's happening. It's very difficult to do. So we have had a number of questions, switching gears. We've had a number of questions about the Canadian, as it's called, the Canadian truck thing. No, but the protests in Canada, and people wondering about these extremists and how right wing is this, and what about Americans who are involved? What about civil rights of if Americans, US Americans are arrested? How do we handle this kind of unrest within and with our close, very close ally to the north?
I think that for one thing, it may not be as big of an issue or become as big of an issue here in the United States with the truckers physically blocking borders as it was in Canada. We heard that possibly that there would be such activity during the Super Bowl, and then possibly during the State of the Union address. It didn't happen at the Super Bowl, not at all. So it appears that this is a Canadian, has been a Canadian issue, although I think there are true attempts to bring it here to the United States. And so it's yet to be seen whether or not that's going to happen. And if so, to what extent. I have not read enough about them regarding any extremists' ideas that they may have. But I did hear reporting. But right now, I think it's just a wait and see, because it's not taken hold here as it did in Canada.
Another Canadian question, but different, about the Canadian intelligence effectiveness. And they're wondering if you believe Canada should invest in a foreign intelligence agency like the CIA, or does the intelligence it receives from the Five Eyes sufficient to protect Canadian national security?
I can jump in on that one, and Deborah, I'm sure has some experience working with Canadians. So for many years in Canada's history, as I understand it, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is a rough equivalent to the FBI, and also they have uniform service, obviously. Pretty cool looking uniforms, I might add. But then they demonstrated that they really did need a foreign intelligence capability, and they created the CSIS, which is the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, that my understanding is they have a presence in embassies globally to the extent of, protecting Canadian interests. I will say that I have talked recently with RCMP, and even at the White House, I work closely with CSIS on some issues that were definitively overseas issues. I think they're a very capable service, and they're great partners with the United States. They are a part of the Five Eyes. And again, RCMP has their responsibilities. They're focused very much on a Proud Boys in Canada, while CSIS is focused on, external threats and providing foreign intelligence. Just to put a finer point on it, a excellent service from my point of view. And again, when I worked with them, they were very responsive and frankly, just a sound service.
Yeah, I agree. I have worked with not the Mounties so much, but CSIS or CSIS in the past, and a great service. They would come to the United States, travel to our headquarters for briefings. We would share information, and a great service to work with.
All right, Chris, I'm sorry. This question is just for Deborah. And it is the first question that came in, but I wanted to I wanted to get Russia and Ukraine off the plate first. How did you, Ms. Smith, how did you overcome the obstacles as a woman in the intelligence field, law enforcement, and agencies such as the FBI? And is there a permanent tracking system for equity, and how are things going and how are they moving forward?
Okay. How did I do it? Sheer determination, literally, from the beginning. As a woman, getting into Quantico, I didn't have an issue as a woman, and I don't think my race really played. And my weight did. I didn't weigh enough. It took me a year to gain enough weight before they would accept me. I had to get up to 97 pounds, and I was like 88 pounds when I started. So it took a year to gain 9 pounds. But once I did that, I was in.
I do not have that problem. I would like to stop here and say I do not have that problem.
Yeah. So I don't anymore. But I will say that in my first office, I really did want to work counterintelligence. And I used to, every time that squad needed volunteers to help them out, I always volunteered, but they wouldn't let new agents at that time work CI. So that's why I went to Russian language school, and then I went to Los Angeles. But I will say this, and this is not a pleasant thing to hear or to tell. But about 2 weeks after I was assigned to my first counterintelligence squad, the second in command of that squad pulled me aside, and he said to me, and I remember his exact words. He said, "You're not going to be successful in this work." And he said, "Not because you're Black." He said, "But also because," he said, "not just because you're Black." He said, "But also because you're a woman. Russians don't talk to women, and they're not going to talk to you." So, you can imagine a younger agent going to a Russian squad, geared up and ready to go and hit the ground running, and you hear something like that. It's not a pleasant thing to hear. I don't recall what I said to him at all, but I worked hard because that's just the way I'm made. But the end of that story is when this agent became a supervisor of his own squad, also a Russian squad, and needed a primary relief supervisor, he asked me to be his primary relief supervisor. So, I mean, there were times when it was difficult. It's not pleasant always being, or a lot of times being the only person who looks like you, the only person of your gender in the room. But that was a frequent thing. It just was. Like currently, the Black female population for agents in the FBI is 1%. That's today. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And when I was working in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, I just thought that was a very important thing to do. And I wish that more people would do it. I wish that more people would care about it, not only women and not only minorities, but I wish that everyone cared about it because it does affect us all.
Do you have any tips, just while we're on this piece, any tips for young people? Because we often have young people listening in. Any tips for getting started in this field, or things to avoid, or things to get interested in to help you build a career?
Sure. Things to avoid. The pitfalls, right? Follow the law. You normally know what's right. Do what's right. You can even look at some of the qualifications of positions that you're interested in, whether it be, with the FBI or the CIA or any other intelligence agency. Look at it and see what they require, and sort of gear yourself towards those things. But always, I say, keep an open mind. Don't pigeonhole yourself. Learn as much as you can. Be diverse as much as you can with your background. And then really just go for it, full speed ahead, whatever it is that you want to do. Don't let anything stop you or stand in your way if that's what you know that you want to do. And especially if you are qualified to do it, don't let anything stop you from doing it, because there's a place for you. There's a place for you in the intelligence community, and don't let anyone tell you that there's not.
That's very inspirational. So I have two, we like to squeeze the marrow out of this. I have two very different and excellent questions. So they'll be random here at the end. Are you seeing a lot of cooperation, or what kind of cooperation, between extremists on the far right and the far left? Where I find that fascinating.
Cooperation between those two groups, the far left and
Yeah, when they make the circle and come together,
no, but we
Okay, good.
not at all. But we do see factions that are blended. For instance, there may be like an alt-right group, but also they're anti-government. So we see those types of blended things, but not with far left and far right together. I've not seen it or heard at all about that. I don't know
So
if you
there,
have, Chris.
yeah, that's a great question. Not on the far left and far right. You're exactly right, Deborah. But I will add that jihadists and white supremacists, there's been a convergence. There's ideology shopping online. This is a trend I started seeing just from my vantage point at the White House and doing work with our counterparts, our colleagues at the FBI and DHS. So it is interesting that sometimes these organizations will set aside their ideology to work with, actors that don't seem to fit. So jihadists, right, working together with, ironically, with neo-Nazis. There's one particular case of a soldier that was indicted for reaching out to first neo-Nazis in England online and then conducting a plan to kill Americans, fellow soldiers in Turkey, as strange as that sounds. So yeah, we see that because of the online virtual opportunities, but certainly not left and right.
Okay, here's a whirlwind final question. If Russia invades Ukraine, would China see this as an opportunity to invade Taiwan while the West is distracted? In 1 minute.
I'll be very, very brief with my answer. I think that China is watching this very closely to see what the West does, to see what what's the agency I'm thinking of? To see what the West does and to see what other countries do, because it will give them sort of a playbook and things to stay away from also. So I think they're watching this very, very closely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Deborah more. I mean, clearly, the United States has been thought of recently as demonstrating, because of Afghanistan, not demonstrating a strength that people are used to seeing, that fair or unfair, that was a perception that started taking hold. I think now you see, again, the story continues to play out, but you hear people saying, did Putin blink? President Biden, came off the top ropes. His determination has been steely, and he didn't blink. So that counters that narrative of some kind of American weakness. And similarly, there have been a lot of pundits and a lot of writing about China is sitting back and watching. Is this their time to all of a sudden use a distraction in Europe to cross the Taiwan Straits? And I have seen some reporting, again, open source, that's all I'm looking at, that China is absolutely watching this extremely closely. And I think if they are watching this closely, so far they would judge the resolve from the West, the fact that NATO, far from being fragmented, has been determined, and they've been steely in their approach. And again, much remains to follow, but I think China's just going to watch this play out very carefully, and I don't expect that that China's going to cross the Taiwan Straits right now.
All right. Well, I have
NATO is what I was trying to think of that we've been talking about all day. So.
There's a lot, right? We throw a lot at you, Deborah.
We have, yeah, and we've pushed it all the way right up till the end of our hour because it's been so fascinating and had lots of nice comments from attendees thanking us for the webinar. I'm sorry, there were a lot of questions that we did not get to, but we did our best. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Deborah, so much. Our next program will be on March 10th. It'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's going to be a throwback. We're going to be talking about Cold War, cameras and photography, the old-timey spy war stuff. So please check our website for that program, other programs for adults and for the youth. And as always, we don't mind if you want to make a donation to thank us for these super cool free programs. And because, people are donating their time. Deborah, thank you for being a terrific guest today. Chris, thank you for being a great guest and a great boss. And Everyone take care, and we'll see you at the next program.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Deborah, for your determination and for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This was a treat. Thanks.